Hello there and welcome. My name's Tracy Stanley. I'm a consultant and writer with expertise in innovation, organizational change, and employee engagement. Now, like many listening today, I'm keen to increase my discoverability and my success as a freelancer. And as luck would have it, today I'm speaking with Richard Newton, who is an award-winning author who writes practical books to help people to get things done. His latest book is called The Freelance Consultant, which is due out, well, depending upon where you are in the world, anytime from the 15th of April until the 15th of May. Hello there, good morning. Richard's in London and I'm here in Brisbane, so we're speaking to each other at the top and the end of each day. Hello, Richard.
Hi, Tracy. Yeah, I'm in the morning in the UK, and it's looking strangely like a good morning, which we're not quite used to.
Yay,
bright and sunny.
Yay. You're coming into spring, so have the daps finished yet?
Yeah, absolutely. They are out. They are out. So it's all looking jolly.
Good. Richard is a prolific writer. Richard, how many books have you written?
Yeah, I always hate that question because I'm never quite sure how to answer it. So, I mean, technically, I've written 18 books. I discount 5 of them because they're quite short ebooks, and I'm a bit old-fashioned like that. So you can say 13 real full-length books, several of which, I think 5 of which now have gone to second edition. So it depends whether you call that a book as well, a second edition.
Oh, that's a milestone moment, Richard.
Yeah, it is. It is.
That's great. Well done. So 13 books or 18 books, that's a very impressive achievement. It's interesting. Richard and I both are writers and we're readers and we're book reviewers. And I'm pretty sure that I found Richard because I was reading one of his reviews and I thought, this is a really interesting character. And so I did as I often do, and I looked him up on LinkedIn and I saw that he had expertise in change management as well. And so Richard and I made a connection. So that's our story about how we met. And it's not, I guess, in this modern online world, and particularly during lockdown, an unusual way to meet other professionals in the industry. Now, today we're going to talk, sorry, Richard.
Yeah, no, I find it fascinating nowadays how I meet people. And funnily enough, I like you, I review every book I read, and I sort of did that as a sideline, but I get more and more connections from that, which is not something I expected, but it's an interesting part of the modern way of work.
Yeah, actually, and it's an interesting channel. Today we're talking about how to be a successful freelancer. And as I mentioned in my introduction, it's about increasing your discoverability. And one thing is, if you write reviews about books from people in your subject knowledge area, then you're bound to trip over people who are interested in your subject area as a subject matter expert. But we'll talk more about that later on. So Richard, you've been a freelancer for a while. What was it that triggered you to be a freelancer, and how would you define a freelance?
Okay, so I'll take both those in sequence. So I became a freelancer back in 2004. So that's what, 15, 16 years ago, 17 years ago. Gosh, time flies. For me, it was actually that I had my first book contract in my hand. I had a mixed career in consultancy and industry, and the book contract came along, and I'd always wanted to write, and I thought, you know what, now's the time to go for it. I'm not going to be able to do this, juggle this with a full-time career. So I want to go freelance. And that's what I did. So it was, for me, it was the books was the trigger.
Okay. And how did you get the book? Did you meet a publisher at an event, or had you been pitching via agents?
Yeah, I mean, I was pretty lucky, I think. And I have to own up, I think it's a bit tougher now. I wrote a book. This is definitely not the way to do it. I wrote a book and then I wrote a proposal. Now, I'd been a consultant, so I had a sense of how to write a proposal. It's something that had been part of my job. And I just spoke around friends, and somebody said, you know, I know somebody in Pearson, and I spoke to that person. They said, well, I'm not really interested, but you might try this person. And I tried that person, and they said, yeah, I really like your proposal. I'd like to publish your book. So I kind of fell on my feet would be the right way of putting it. I assumed it was always as easy as that. And therefore I gave up work and became a writer. I soon learned it wasn't always quite that simple, but you know, it was how I got going anyway.
Okay, so that's interesting. So that was your first book. So what about this book? This is number 19. How did you research and write The Freelance Consultant?
Okay, so I have a process. I mean, I've evolved the process over the time, and you start writing with a blank sheet of paper, but and then you learn there's a mechanism to it. So for non-fiction books, they always start with an observation. So I have an observation about something or other, and in the case of this book, it was really just observing the chatter, actually on LinkedIn mostly, about freelancers and listening to problems people had. And it struck me that although there's a lot of good advice for freelancers out there, if you want to do, specific targeted things, how to build your LinkedIn network or how to market to certain type of customers. But what I couldn't see was if you like, a framework which said, look, here's all the different things you need to think about when you're a freelancer. So I had this observation that, there's an opportunity to write a book which says, look, here's kind of like the ABC of setting yourself up as a freelancer. Everything from getting going through to how you impress your clients and that sort of thing. So I had that observation. So after that, I then collate my thoughts, and that's again normal part of my process. I have lots of bits of paper floating around, and as I'm working, I just make observations and further thoughts until I've got enough material. I think this is the skeleton for a book. And then, of course, those are just my thoughts, and when you start to put it into a book, you realize there's things you need to go out and verify with other people. Your opinion may or may not be right. And then there are gaps, things I didn't know about. And so I chose some people I knew in my network. I've got a reasonably extensive network, and I interviewed a number of people. And actually in the book, I've got 13 of those interviews in the book, other freelancers giving their views on it. So if you like, at that point, I've just got a big chunk of material. And then I start to write. And I suppose about a third of the way through the writing process, I think I've got my feel for the book, and then I'll start to develop a proposal and approach publishers to see if they're interested. So that's kind of the process, and it would be similar for all books, but the observation stage is obviously slightly different for each book. What's the observation I make?
Interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, you talked about pulling the skeleton together. I certainly find playing with the table of contents is a good way of sort of structuring your thinking about what needs to go in, and then you can test, as you said, go out to the market and test what
Yeah,
people want to learn about.
yeah, I think there's something definitely about that table of contents that you start with one, and then you find, oh, look, that bit that I thought was a chapter really isn't enough to be a chapter, or that bit that I thought was a chapter is actually 2 chapters. There's far too much material there, and it's you sort of juggle through and find your way through to get the right balance of content.
Mm, mm. So, Richard, you said you've been a freelancer for over 15 years now. And since that time, there's been a real growth, hasn't there, in people being
Oh yeah.
freelance consultants. Why do you think there's been so much growth?
Yeah, I mean, I'd stress this is the think. I don't have science around this or a lot of empirical data, but I think there's been a change both on, if you like, the demand side and the supply side. So on the demand side, so people hiring freelancers, I think a lot more of us as independent people will hire freelancers on our own, people like coaches, but also in the corporate field, which is where, as a consultant, I'm generally working. There's been a big change in companies. I mean, I started working donkeys years ago, and I first started working actually for Eastman Kodak, for those who remember filming cameras. And, in those days, Kodak employed every single person in every single skill it needed. It was a massive firm. Well, most organizations aren't like that anymore. They've delayered, they've sort of realized there are areas they only need now and again, or there are skills they don't think they're specialists in and don't want to have to maintain that capability. So they hire more externals, and I think freelancers are part of that. And people have got more used to it, and with familiarity grows trust.
Mm.
So if you like, that's the demand side. I think the interesting bit's on the supply side, which is more and more people have become freelancers. You've got people like myself who've had a career and then become freelance. But I think what's really interesting now is the number of people who coming out of college or university are now starting to say, you know what, I don't want to work for somebody. I'm going to become a freelancer. I think it's a big thing to do, but it used to be a bit of a, there used to be a bit of a snootiness between people in corporate jobs and freelancers. And I think that's starting to reverse. And I think certainly amongst younger population, there's I'm independent and I'm proud of that. And I want the thing that goes to independence. I think, it has to be fair. This has all been enabled by social media. So things like LinkedIn, we all have a much bigger reach and a much easier to find customers than it used to be. But yeah, so I think change on both the demand and supply side, but it's a radically different place employment market than when I started, and I think it will continue to evolve. And I'm pretty confident there'll actually be, if we were having this conversation in 10 or 20 years time, there'll be even more freelancers.
So if someone's listening is a new graduate, or even if they're a more experienced person who's leaving corporate life, how do you find those first clients?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think I'm gonna park the new graduate. I think it is. I really admire new graduates who jump into freelancing. I think it's a tough ask because, you know, there's normally you've got to have some area of expertise. I know some people have done it, but I think it's a challenge. I think get a little bit of experience under your belt would be my general advice. But for someone with experience, the first client, most of us get our first client from somebody we know, you know, so it's about the network we have and the people we know now. So if you take me, I'd worked for some years in the telecoms industry, and when I became freelance, what I started doing is talking to all my contacts in the telecoms industry. And, you know, sooner or later somebody says, you know what, I could do with someone like you who's got your skills. And I think it goes to a bigger issue with freelancing, which is there's lots and lots of things about finding clients and finding good clients. It's a big subject in its own, but fundamentally it does come down to your network. And that's not necessarily about having a huge network. I know there's a lot of people who want to have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in their network, whatever platform that's on. I think it's about having a targeted network of people of the sorts of clients you want. And most of us who are freelancers put quite a lot of effort into building our network and getting the people, the sorts of people who we think we're going to sell our services to into our network, so that we can start to build those connections and build those relationships. And to some extent, when they have a problem that we are the right shaped skill set to fit, they'll come to us automatically. I mean, the ideal scenario is someone picks up the phone and rings you, and all that, once you get to a certain level, actually starts to happen. I think it's trickier than that to begin with. And the other thing to say is that, I mean, to make it too simple, but I think there are two ways that freelancers go to market. So you can go direct to clients or you can go indirect. And, you know, the classic would be IT contractors. Certainly in the UK, I'm pretty sure in Australia as well, most IT contractors don't actually go direct to clients. They go through agencies, and agencies who find work for them. You know, so if that's your direction, then you obviously need to find the agencies and build relationships with those. If you're like me, and you find your clients directly, it is about just being in dialogue, being in conversation with clients. It's not that much about hard sales in my mind. It's more about just keeping that dialogue going with a sufficiently large network. It doesn't have to be huge, but it has to be sufficiently large that at a reasonably regular interval, somebody comes along and says, right, now's the time for me to hire you. So I think about it more about building network and building relationships than your classic sales process.
Sure. It's interesting you've talked about being in conversation with the your right targets. How do you do that? I know kind of the general sales speak is often about, well, you've got to think about, your potential customer may need to hear from you 6 or 7 times. How do you choose what it is you follow up with and have these conversations with these prospects? How do you manage that, Richard? Tell me more.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, if you take me personally, so and I'll let me just touch on the 6 or 7. I have to say I'm always slightly suspicious of rule of thumbs like that, but I do absolutely know, and experience shows that just because someone says yeah, now's not the time, doesn't mean you don't follow up. You do follow up with people.
Yeah.
To me, I keep bluntly, I have a spreadsheet, so I have all the people I'm in conversation with. It sounds very mechanistic. All the people I'm in conversation with at the moment, and there's sort of 2 thoughts going on in that when I'm looking at the people in that list. That is, and remember, this is a list of people I want to get work from. So it's not, I'm not trying to build friends, or I may build friends through this, but it's a goal direct activity. And there's 2 things I'm looking for. One is that there's sufficient people in life. actually three things: that there's a sufficient number of people in that I'm having conversations with at any time. Now, for each of us as consultants or freelancers, depends on the service, we need different numbers of customers. So for me, I need about 4 or 5 customers a year. That's all I need. I don't need 100.
Yeah.
If you're something like a coach, you probably need more because you're selling smaller chunks of work.
Yeah.
But so you have an idea of how many customers, and the pool of people you're talking to has got to be bigger than that number, but not orders of magnitude bigger.
Yeah.
And I'm constantly stripping out people and going, I've been talking to this person for absolutely ages. I don't think it's going to go anywhere. I may touch base with them in a year's time, but I think I'm going down a dead avenue. Because the other thing about a freelancer, you can't spend all your time trying to sell. You've got to have time to do the work.
Yeah.
So you need to be fairly targeted. So it's stripping people out. And then it's getting that sense from some people, look, this conversation is going somewhere. And the way you tell a conversation is going somewhere is you start to drift away from generic conversations and generic within your field to much more specific. I've got a problem of shape X, and you start to get into that dialogue. Well, I've got a skill set of shape X that would help you solve that problem. So it's that sensing your way through and focusing down on the ones that are getting you to the right place. The other thing, though, I'd say, and this is something that a lot of freelancers only learn after a while, is a really great channel for your work is other freelancers, because the truth is there's a lot of us doing this. And that's quite often I'll get, and somebody will say in my network will say, hey, Richard, I've got a problem. It's shape Y. I'd really love you to come and help. And I sort of go, yeah, I'd love to as well. But actually, I don't have that skill set.
Yeah.
I don't have that skill set. But, I know a few other freelancers who do. And a fair bit of my work I give out to other people. But the truth is a fair bit of my work has come from other freelancers who've come to me and said, either I'm too busy or it's not quite the right skill set for me. Would this interest you, Richard? Because if it does, I'll introduce you. So don't forget your freelance friends. You can get quite a lot of work that way, and giving somebody else some work or a lead will pay dividends later on in your career as well. Does that help?
Like that observation. That's a really nice observation. And it's about not seeing all other freelance consultants as competitors. Have a sort of a generosity mindset. I guess recognize what you're good at and what where it's worth you spending your time, where your expertise is. I think that's
yeah. I mean, I got a lead, and I won't go into the details, but it was about gamification, and I've done some gamification. But I was talking to the client, and I realized this is way beyond my skill set.
Yeah.
And I introduced them to someone I know, and a day later, the person rings me back and says, "Great, okay, that's really helpful. Thank you very much for that. I think this is going in this direction, Richard, because I've had a deeper conversation. There'll be something in this for you as well." So, of course, one doesn't want to be naive. Some freelancers are actually direct competitors, but most aren't.
Yeah.
Most aren't.
Okay. What about conversations around, well, first of all, calculating what you're worth and how you charge? So it's interesting. You're talking about you need 4 to 5 customers a year. So you probably know about what chunk of work, you need to get. £20,000 from 4 or 5, you make those sort of estimations.
Yeah.
So you've got to calculate that, and then you've got to manage this conversation with the client. And there's often this perception that, objectives aren't aligned. They want to get the cheapest rate. And how do you manage the conversation around making sure you get what you're worth for the risk that's associated with being a freelancer?
Yeah, I mean, I think a great question, and I'd love to tell you. Here is the algorithm which will exactly tell you what to charge, and your clients will always say yes. And of course, it is a bit of an art.
Yeah.
That's an overused word, but this really is the one part that's a bit of an art. So, the first thing I'd say is the model you present of the client wants to get you as cheap as possible, and you want to get as high a rate as possible. I think it's overly. It makes it sound more confrontational than it is.
Yeah.
There are clients I have who really have never quibbled about rates. They just want problem solved. And, you quote a rate and they say, yeah, great, get on with it. And if you've got trust with your clients and clients used you so many times, then that works. Now, I would be lying to say if all my clients are like that, but I've got some.
Yeah.
At the other extreme, there are some clients that within 5 minutes of a conversation, I know, look, I don't want to work for these people. If they're going to haggle about every single moment of everything, then I'm frankly not interested. And one bit of advice for freelancers I always say is, remember, you can always say no to a client. There are plenty of clients you don't want, and let somebody else service somebody else who's willing to work for half your rate. They can have them. So you've got those two extremes. The really good clients who never really haggle. Obviously, you can't be ridiculous, but they never really haggle. Hold on to those people with your dear life. Manage the relationships closely. You want to be their friends. The ones you don't like, just don't do work for, or if you do work, try and get out of it as quickly as possible. And then you've got that big chunk in the middle, the sort of, these are savvy clients who, they don't want to screw you down to the absolute minimum, but they're looking after their company's money. That's their professional role. So respect them for that. The answer is that there's going to be, again, two scenarios. One will be, if it's literally a commodity skill set, there may well be a price in the market, and they may well be looking at benchmark rates. And in that case, if you've got a completely commodity skill set, then you're going to have to go with what the market will bear. Most of us, though, over time, we have some bits that make us different, and it might be some specific industry expertise, it might be some particular angle. And take the conversation I was talking about last. I mean, I'm in change management like yourself, and I had a client who was particularly looking for someone who knew games to teach people about change management. Now, I don't know any. I've done a few, but it's not my expertise. If you have something like that, that's a bit different. And then you're in a slightly different position about price point, because there is no comparison. And there is an element of having a negotiation with the client around, well, this is what I want. So, I'm not giving you exact numbers, because I can't give you exact numbers, but I think it is about understanding your strategy for what sort of clients and how you're going to negotiate with them. And, the bottom line, never be afraid to walk away if it's going completely in the wrong direction, rates wise.
So it's good observations there, Richard. Certainly, I guess it's something new consultants fear, the conversations around price and value.
Yeah.
Well, what are some of the other challenges that new freelancers face?
So I think new freelancers and face a variety of challenges. I mean, two I would particularly pick up. There is that panic, that sense of panic, which is day one. I'm now my own boss. Whoopee, I'm independent. I can do what I like. That sounds great. But day one, and the phone isn't ringing, and the emails are not pinging, or if they are pinging, they're from all your friends and family saying, "Isn't it great that you've set up your own business?" But they're not going to give you any work, so that's not particularly helpful. So there is that panic, and if that occurs, then my response is just remember, there's millions and millions of people who've gone down this route before, and every single one of them felt that day one. Yeah, so don't get too panicked. The other thing I would say, though, is, and I see this a lot, is remember, when you become a freelancer, you are setting up a business, and therefore you have to do everything that a business does. So although when we think of freelancers, we think about selling to clients and doing the work to client, there's all the other stuff you need to do, whether it's doing your accounts, not necessarily particularly interesting, but it has to be done, billing your clients and sending in your invoices, working out and building networks and selling yourself. So you have to time slice across a lot more things than you would have to do as an employee. And I think that for a lot of beginners, it's just getting your head around, what are all those things that I need to do, and what's the right balance? And again, I don't think there's a global balance. I think it depends who you are and what you do. So, for example, I spend so many hours a week building my network and maintaining contact with people. I know other consultants and other freelancers I know spend far less, but I also know some people who spend far more because they're selling slightly different services. But getting that idea of what is that set of things and where's the appropriate balance of my time, I think does take a bit of time. And how I resolve that is, funny enough, when I started, one of my friends who'd been a freelancer for a few years just said, come down to my house and sit in my office, and I'm just going to talk you through what I do on a day-to-day basis. And it sounds terribly, terribly tedious, but it was great. And he said things like, this is a few years ago, here's the file where I put my expenses receipts. And you sit there and think, oh God, I hadn't even thought about expenses receipts. And there's just lots of little bits and pieces. It's not difficult. It's not rocket science. It's a very finite list of things, but it's probably more than you would realize if you hadn't done it before. So bottom line, I would say, obviously I'd like you to buy my book, but, I'd say go and find a friend. Most of us know someone who's done it for a few years, and just say, walk me through all the things you need to do. Even the mundane things, even the things you think are really dull, because then I get a picture of all the things I need to spend my time on.
Wow, that's great advice, Richard. That's great advice. So I wanted to sort of have a wrap-up question around what tips you'd give to freelancers. Let me just recap on some of the things you've been sharing already. You've talked about the importance of building networks, about identifying who is the client, the right sort of client to be targeting for your sorts of service, and keeping a track of that. If it's not in a customer relationship management system, at least in an Excel sheet, and making sure you're systematically following it up. You also talked about, being aware of when you aren't comfortable with the client, and remembering that you can say no to that sort of client, because there's some clients you don't want. You've talked about learning from others and working with others, sharing business, and then talking to more experienced clients who perhaps can show you what their daily habits are like and how they manage, how they balance their time between doing the work and finding the work. What were some of the other tips you learned? I mean, not only from your own experience, but from those dozen or so people you interviewed for your book.
Yeah, let me pick some that come to my head straight away. So one is, it's a business, so you got to worry about cash flow. And, the old model of the freelancer of, when we've got a good contract, we're walking on clouds and we think nothing could go wrong with the world. And then there'll be a time when nobody's ringing the phone, and everybody has periods when we're not as busy as we'd like to be. So think about cash flow. Keep a little bit more cash in your business account than you might naturally do, because you will have some slow periods.
Yeah.
That could be tough to start with, especially if you're starting straight out of college, because I tend to advise people to have a 6-month amount of money set aside. Not so you can live a lavish life for 6 months, but you can get by for 6 months, so that if the worst comes to the worst, you can do that. 3 months an absolute minimum. So worry about your cash flow would be one of the things. The other would be, if you go into a contract with a client, so a client for a piece of contract, look at the notice periods on that as well. And because although a client may hire you to do a great long piece of work, of course that can end at any time. Usually it doesn't, so one shouldn't be paranoid, but bear in mind that contracts can finish earlier than you might expect. And it's a business proposition. It's nothing personal. We mustn't get too personal about these sorts of things. And that's the other thing I would sort of say as a freelancer. As a freelancer, we don't really differentiate between ourselves and our business. We are one and the same thing. But to somebody buying our services, it's a business proposition. And sometimes they'll do things which feel hurtful to us individually. And we just have to say, look, it's not a personal thing. It's about business. And if you are hiring business, you might do the same. So don't get too wound up, because otherwise you will get your ego and your emotions will get a bit bruised at times. And the only other thing, I'd go back to one of the points you mentioned is, find a friend. There's lots of freelancers. I generally find they're very generous with time, very generous, always happy to talk to other freelancers. And there are opportunities, of course, to hire and use freelancers yourself. So, most of us have an accountant, and if there are bits you don't like maybe you hate social media, I bet you there's another freelancer out there who possibly for a reasonable rate will help you with your own social media profile. So think about how you might use freelancers yourselves. That's kind of, I think, key tips off the top of my head.
Oh, that's great. There's some real gems there, Richard. And of course, I'd encourage everyone who's listening who isn't a freelancer already and wants to sort of build their business more or want to start out, I'd encourage you to buy Richard's book. I've read it. It's very, very good. And I particularly liked not only what Richard shared from his own experience, but the stories from other freelancers who are in the book. As I said at the beginning, it's due out, and I guess it'd be on Amazon and Apple and all the main channels from
it will.
Would that be right?
It will be. It will indeed. It will indeed.
Okay. For those who want to know more about Richard, like myself, is on LinkedIn. You can find Richard at his website, which is www.enixus.co.uk. And you can find me at tjstanley.com. So thank you very much, Richard. It's been wonderful to talk to you today.
Thanks, Tracy. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. And happy learning and growing your business, freelancers out there. Okay. Bye.
Bye.